Gould's The Birds of Australia in particular, that book is going to be familiar to so many of us. And it's such a visual memory too. When did you discover that the images in that book and in John Gould's other work, when did you discover those images were made by a woman, Elizabeth Gould?
A friend of mine lent me a biography of John Gould because I'd become quite a passionate birdwatcher. And of course, like many people, I'd heard of John Gould, and in this biography he was portrayed as quite an aggressive person who almost took advantage of others to put himself forward, and Elizabeth was written about in this context, and I had no idea, I hadn't heard of her at all, and her life was so fascinating and so shadowy and patchy that I really wanted to find out more about her.
And what, in the broadest possible sense, what did she do? Is it right to say that she did all of the images in his books?
So she started the publishing enterprise with him. If it wasn't for Elizabeth, John Gould would never have ventured into producing hand-coloured lithographs because his artistic talents were like a child's, very threadbare. So because of Elizabeth, she was unpaid employment. They went into this partnership. She already drew for him as an artist, and she worked with him for the first 11 years, but unfortunately she died quite young. So she did 650 hand-coloured lithographs across about 8 collections, and then John Gould continued to have a career for another 40 years, so he worked with different artists after she died.
Remind us when she was doing this work, when she was making these sketches and lithographs and so on.
So this is between 1830 to 1841.
How did you begin to track her down once she caught your interest? How hard was she to find?
She was a little bit difficult to find. I just started to, as anyone does, read about her on the internet. And I found her very enigmatic because she'd had many children and she'd left some of her children in England to travel out to Australia for 2 years. But I couldn't find out enough information about her. But also, because I found her so fascinating, I thought that, in a way, this would be a great project for an historical novel, and readers would connect with her surely, like I had connected with her. And so to really intensify my research, I enrolled in a PhD and really started using the archives and resources.
How much of a trace did she leave in the archive?
That's really fascinating for me because just like in the biography, it's called The Biography of John Gould, she's enclosed within its pages and she's a shadowy figure. It was actually very similar in terms of finding her in the archives, and it's a similar pattern as well with the folios that they produced. So John Gould's name's all over them, his name's in the frontispiece, and then on each plate there's a little signature, J and E Gould. And so Elizabeth is an E, that's all she is. Similarly, in John Gould's published correspondence, there's about 7 volumes. There's about 3,000 of his letters that have been published and transcribed. Elizabeth's letters are enclosed within this publication with no mention whatsoever of her, on the outside of the book.
So there are some letters from her. You did find some of her words.
Yes, I did. So in 1838, the Goulds came out to Australia and they spent 2 years here. And 100 years after their visit to Australia, the Australian Ornithological Society wanted to commemorate the centenary of their visit, and lots of articles are written about them. And a gentleman called Alec Chisholm, who was a bird watcher and a journalist, went to England and he tracked down a woman called Grace Edelston, who was a descendant of the Goulds, and had a chat to her and found out that she was in possession of 14 letters that Elizabeth had written to her mother while she was in Australia, and also a small diary. And this was the first material ever found that shows us a little bit about Elizabeth's personality and the sort of person she was, the sorts of thoughts she had, what she cared about. Because prior to that, she was mentioned in a couple of lines in one of John Gould's letters, or occasionally there was a review of their material and she was mentioned as the artist, but that was it.
Before we get to that experience of her travelling to Australia, I want to get a bit more of a sense of her as a working woman, because that's part of the pleasure, Melissa, of your novel, is that you're getting this quite complex portrait of a working mother. So how did she come to be an artist?
I'd come across a reference to her as a talented botanical artist in one of the resources, and I tried to find out where that came from, but I could find nothing in the records about any artistic training that she had or any artistic experience prior to basically getting married to John Gould. And she started out illustrating birds for him to put into his letters that he wrote to other ornithologists. So say there was a new toucan discovered and you can only convey so much in words. So Elizabeth would draw the bird for him because he couldn't draw. And then she became involved in the drawing process of producing their first book, A Century of Birds from the Himalaya Mountains, which was a 2-volume luxury illustrated folio of 80 species of Indian birds. And she basically became a professional illustrator through this process. So she could already draw and she could already paint, but she learnt to transfer her artworks onto lithographic stones and have them printed in that way. So she really learned on the job.
That process of transferring the vibrance of a bird and the beauty and intensity of the colour onto plates, what did you have to learn to write about that in your book? Like, just how complicated a process is it?
Yes, it's quite complicated. So the Goulds were involved with a man called Hanmundal. He was their printer, but he was also an artist, and he was the first person to suggest, I suppose, that lithography could be used in an aesthetic sense, because it had been around for about 60 years.
Now, what is lithography?
Lithography is a printmaking technology, so it uses a slab of limestone, and a drawing of what is to be reproduced is put onto the limestone, and then it's put into the presses and reproduced, so you can get 100 copies of that. And so it's a monochrome image. And then with the Goulds who coloured it, and then it was hand-coloured by a group of colourists, so that they were hand-coloured plates.
And so you describe this imagined woman, this artist, having to think about how she could capture these colours. And so she's having to experiment with pigments, put sugar and water washes over things, grind in bits of copper. So it's not just about grabbing your set of paints, is it? I mean, it's much more both sort of scientific and imaginative at the same time.
Yes, and I think that's something that really drew me to the process, because it was this time in history and culture where there wasn't so much of a separation between the aesthetic and the scientific. So she had two things to achieve. She had to reproduce a scientifically accurate depiction of the species, and they really wanted to make it very beautiful. So if you have a look at Elizabeth's lithographs, her technique improved very, very quickly after their first publication, and she continually experimented with new innovations. So they would use egg white, for example, and whip it up, and I think they added a bit of sugar to it, and then they painted this lovely gloss where they needed that on the feathers. Or they used a metallic powder and sprinkled that over the top of the painting, for example, with the beautiful resplendent Quetzal plate.
How do you understand what was going on in the world in that time, in the 1830s, that made the natural world such a focus, both scientifically and in the popular realm?
This was a really interesting time for a number of different sorts of people. So for people who are seriously interested in ornithology, and then for collectors and aesthetes who collected beautiful cabinets of birds and also the sorts of luxury folios that the Goulds made. It was also seen as a hobby for Victorians to get involved in, and in fact it was seen as something appropriate for women to do with their, various accomplishments that they could make. For example, learning the piano and learning to sing and learning to draw flowers. They could also involve themselves in natural history and the ways and means of collecting and preserving and describing animals and shells. You could do it in your own home, and it was so popular that pamphlets were published about how to do this, so it was quite a popular activity at that time.
Taxidermy was a big part of this world, though, wasn't it? So you've got this sort of odd connection between dead animals, science, collecting what's popular. What did you need to understand about taxidermy in order to write this book?
So John Gould started out as a taxidermist, and he had a really successful business as a taxidermist. He was one of London's top taxidermists, and he was self-taught, and he was only 19, 20 at the time.
What was he stuffing?
Oh, he was stuffing people's dead Alsatians. You know, people wanted to keep them in the living room, and he was also stuffing birds from all over the world that collectors liked. He was stuffing for King George. He stuffed a bustard, and he also created a taxidermic mount of a giraffe, which was a huge process. I think it took about 3 months. So the reason that I became interested in taxidermy was through bird watching and through obviously my interest in writing the book, because I wanted to get up close, just as Elizabeth had, to the birds that she had sitting on her desk while she was drawing, because she needed to see the sheen of their feathers. She needed to open out their wings so that she could reproduce every single feather in that primary wing. She needed to know how the tail spread, all the intricate colours. So I visited the Queensland Museum to do a behind-the-scene tour of the vertebrate laboratory, which is where the scientific skins and the taxidermy happens. And also they have out the back of the museum, you know, their huge collection. I think they have 60,000 skins in all the drawers and everything that you used to love opening as a child. And so I went to see those, and these albatrosses and eagles and all sorts of birds that were hanging off the ceiling and everything in the back of the museum. And I just knew this would be such an incredible, visceral, fascinating, inspiring experience for me as a writer, because I'm getting up close to everything. And so every Wednesday, a group of volunteers come to the museum, and they're the ones who prepare the scientific skins. They're a really fascinating and passionate bunch of people. And when I met them for the first time, I was telling them about my project, and they thought it was really interesting. And then one of the women sort of dared me and said, "Why don't you come back next week and we'll teach you how to do it. Why don't you come and learn about it?" And I was a little bit taken aback, but then I thought, well, why not? So I joined the crew and did taxidermy at the museum for about a year.
And yet John and Elizabeth Gould didn't decide just to rely on stuffed species. They got on a boat and travelled to Australia, which seems pretty extraordinary, really, because they already had how many children by this point?
Yes, so they had 4 children. Their eldest was 7 and their youngest was 6 months. And before they came out, when they were figuring out their itinerary and doing all of their plans, it seems from my research that they had planned to take the whole family with them. And then they realised that this wasn't such a good idea. It was actually very dangerous for children to come out to Australia, you know, to make such a long journey because of diseases and because of the conditions of the boat and, you know, all the unknown factors that they would be faced with when they arrived in the colony. So you'd probably only take your children out if you were, you know, emigrating. So what they did do was take their eldest son, who was 7, with them, but they left their 3 youngest children in England in the care of Elizabeth's mother and a cousin. And her youngest child was only 6 months old, a little girl, and she had a 2.5-year-old and then a 4-year-old son who was packed off to boarding school.
Now, I think we're talking too much about the historical story and not enough about your fictional version. So how much does Elizabeth's story need fiction to flesh it out?
I think because there's quite scant resources about her. She has left a very slim record, besides her illustrations, obviously. That biography, I don't think, can do justice to her. Well, obviously it could do justice to her story, but I'm a fiction writer and I'm very interested in imagining what it was like to be her in her interior life, in the emotions, in what it felt like, the experiences that she might have had that made her this extraordinary person.
As a sort of imaginative project, one of the things that it seemed to me you were grappling with, and I'd be curious about your response to this, was the relationship to death, because this scientific project that Elizabeth was at the centre of, it required the killing of so very many specimens. How did you choose to write about that?
That was something I had to think about a lot, and my ideas about how I wanted to depict it and how I depicted it in early drafts changed, because I was very aware of the contemporary reader and of finding the reader's sympathy for what they did, we might today not understand the way species were procured with all the shooting and the almost quite brutal stuffing and collecting of specimens. I was very concerned to have the reader understand this process. And so Elizabeth, in her letters, she expressed a number of times her reserves to her mother about John's enterprise. And at one point she said, "I hope he leaves some of the birds in the skies. He's shooting left, right and centre."
So this is in the few letters that exist.
Yes.
She expressed this. She
did. She expressed, I guess, some ambivalence about, because John was just such an obsessive person and she wasn't as obsessed as him. So she did have reservations, and I really tapped into that for the reader, I think, to put across that it wasn't just this buffet or smorgasbord of pulling all these birds out of the sky and drawing them for one's scientific fame.
Melissa, bird fanciers are a passionate lot, and you're writing about this book and these collections that are so central to so many people's ideas of, going bird watching, of referring to these books. What do you hope your fictional process will do to the way that people now look at either birds or this important reference work?
I'm really interested in the story of the discovery of Australian birds by Europeans, obviously. So the way I write in quite a lyrical way, and I have poetic descriptions of the birds, and I also emphasise how Elizabeth wasn't just a scientist, wasn't just interested in the scientific side of birds, but also liked folklore and myth and poetry and everything, and how birds were used in those ways as well culturally. I really wanted to bring the story of the discovery of Australia's birds in a scientific sense, but also in a delightful sense as well to the reader, because our birds are unique. And yes.
Were you angry about the way she'd been rendered, at least mostly invisible?
It was frustrating, and what was particularly frustrating, it's almost 200 years since she made her contributions, and over again, through 150 years of writing about her, she time and again is presented as the sidekick, as the acolyte, as the assistant, and also as the domesticated, pleasant, controlled Victorian mother. And after a while, the relentlessness of those depictions became quite frustrating to me. And I think that is at the heart of, along with the birds, but that was at the heart of what I wanted to do by bringing Elizabeth out from behind those sorts of representations and give a fuller picture of her.
And you've certainly changed the way that I will look at those images and think about how they were made forevermore, really. So, Melissa Ashley, thank you so much for The Birdman's Wife.